What molds courage into being? Is it found in the scream of resistance or in the quiet moments before it? In this episode of Gateway Books by Crestance, we step into the legacy of the Mirabal sisters, known to the world as the Butterflies, through the lens of Julia Alvarez's unforgettable novel, In the Time of the Butterflies. The story doesn't end with fiction. We continue with the searing intimacy of the letters of Minerva Mirabal and Manolo Tavárez, love and resistance in the time of Trujillo. And finally, the quiet resilience found in Alive in Their Garden by Dedé Mirabal, the sister who survived to remember. Together, these books tell a story not only of defiance, but of love, grief, and the enduring power of memory. Welcome to episode 5. History remembers many dictators, but far fewer of those who stood against them, and fewer still when they were women. In 1960, 3 sisters in the Dominican Republic were murdered for their resistance to the Trujillo regime. Their names, Patria, Minerva, and María Teresa Mirabal, live on as symbols of courage in the face of oppression. I'm Cindy Cruz, your host, and this is Gateway Books by Crestance, where we trace the threads between historical fiction and real-life events, using books as our guide to explore the lives behind the headlines and the legacies they leave behind. In this episode, we revisit the Mirabal sisters not as distant icons, but as women, daughters, mothers, partners, and sisters who chose to resist one of the most brutal regimes in Latin American history. Their history unfolds through 3 powerful books. Julia Alvarez's In the Time of the Butterflies, a reimagining of their inner lives. The letters of Minerva Mirabal and Manolo Tavárez, a collection of love and defiance exchanged from prison. And Alive in Their Garden, the memoir of Dedé Mirabal, who lived to carry on their memory forward. This episode asks not what happened, but how we remember, how the written word keeps history rooted in the human heart. Let's begin. Julia Alvarez's In the Time of the Butterflies begins not with revolution, but with memory and with questions. Who were these women, really? What did they hope for before the world named them martyrs? And how does a life shift from the personal to the political? Published in 1994, Alvarez's novel imagines the lives of the Mirabal sisters, Patria, Minerva, and María Teresa, who were murdered for their resistance to the Trujillo dictatorship in the Dominican Republic. Alongside them was Dedé, the 4th sister, who survived and became the keeper of their story. Through Alvarez's careful attention to voice, history, and emotional truth, In the Time of the Butterflies transforms a national tragedy into an intimate portrait of 4 very different women whose lives converged in courage. The novel unfolds in alternating chapters told from the perspective of each sister, weaving between past and present. Dedé speaks from the future, remembering. The others speak from the heart of their lives as they're lived. This layered structure creates a rhythm, a sense that memory itself is active, moving, and unfinished. Minerva is often the first sister readers connect with. Spirited, bold, driven by justice, even in childhood. Alvarez writes her with fire. She challenges her parents, questions her teachers, and insists on becoming a lawyer in a country where that ambition is neither expected nor encouraged for women. Her awakening to the realities of Trujillo's regime come not through ideology, but through friendship. When she discovered that her friend's father has been disappeared by the regime, the abstract becomes personal. And that is where her resistance begins, not in grand gestures, but in small, irrevocable recognitions. What makes Minerva's journey so absorbing is that her defiance is never simple. Her choices are brave, but not without cost. She knows fear intimately and pushes through it with clarity, not recklessness. Her revolutionary spirit emerges as a natural extension of who she is, someone who cannot and will not look away. Her sister Patria is in many ways her opposite. She begins with faith, a longing to become a nun, a life steeped in prayer, tradition, and domesticity. She marries young, becomes a mother, and seems content to remain outside the turbulent world Minerva enters. But life had other plans for her. On a religious retreat, Patria witnesses a massacre. A young boy is gunned down before her eyes. That moment shakes her faith, not in God, but in the goodness of the world she thought she understood. Her grief deepens into conviction, and from that grief comes a new form of devotion, one that binds her to the resistance, not only as a citizen, but as a mother fighting for her children's future. Alvarez writes Patria's voice with softness, prayerfulness, and depth. The quiet power of somebody who never thought to fight, but refuses to turn away once it reaches her doorstep. The youngest sister, María Teresa, also known as Mate, begins her chapter as a schoolgirl, writing in her diary about shoes, hairdos, and crushes. Her voice is bubbly, carefree, and even vain at times. But through her, Alvarez explores the transformation of innocence into resolve. At first, Mate is drawn to the resistance through Minerva's influence, tagging along more out of admiration than belief. But over time, her understanding of the stakes deepens. She begins to see the cruelty of the regime not as distant news, but as a threat to everything she loves. Mate's imprisonment and torture later in the novel are harrowing, yet her diary entries remain full of warmth and insight. She clings to hope, to love, and to the belief that her suffering might mean something beyond herself. It's in Mate that we see the revolution through the eyes of the very young, the ones who grow up too fast, too painfully, in the shadows of violence. And then there is Dedé, the sister who did not join the underground movement and who, because of that, lived. Her chapters open and close the novel, told from her vantage point decades later after her sister's deaths. People still come to ask about them, to stand in the garden where they played, to take pictures, to touch history, and she, always, is the one left to remember. Alvarez gives Dedé a voice shaped by guilt, but also by love. She did not take the same risks. She didn't share in the same sacrifices, and yet she carries her sister's memory with a sense of purpose, tending it, protecting it, offering it to others. Her life is not a footnote to theirs, it is the continuation. In telling their story, she reclaims her own. There is something deeply moving about the way Alvarez handles this act of survival, not as lesser, but as essential. Dedé shows us that there is more than one way to be brave. There is the courage of confrontation, and there is the courage of carrying on. The language of the novel is elegant, rhythmic, and often poetic. Alvarez weaves Dominican Spanish into the dialogue, grounding the story in place and culture. Each sister has her own distinct voice, not just in tone, but in outlook, personality, and form. The structural choice to rotate narrators makes the novel feel alive, constantly shifting. We are not observers, we are invited into the sisters' thoughts, their faith, their arguments, their laughter. And in the spaces between, Alvarez gives us history, not as textbook fact, but as lived experience. Rafael Trujillo ruled the Dominican Republic with an iron grip for over 30 years, cultivating a personality cult that seeped into every corner of daily life. His regime relied on surveillance, censorship, violence, and a network of fear. Against this, the Mirabal sisters show resistance, knowing full well the risks. By fictionalizing their story, Alvarez gives us access not just to the facts, but to the emotional landscape behind them. She doesn't claim to know everything these women thought or felt, but she imagines them with care. And that act, imagining women into history, giving them dimensions, flaws, doubts, and dreams, is itself a powerful form of remembrance. Today, the legacy of the Mirabal sisters extends far beyond the Dominican Republic. November 25th, the day they were killed, is now recognized by the United Nations as the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women. Their story, once whispered and feared, is now spoken around the world. But perhaps the greatest gift of In the Time of the Butterflies is the way it reclaims these women not as symbols, but as sisters, laughing, arguing, writing letters, raising children. They are not perfect. They are not untouchable. They are real. And in making them real, Alvarez allows us to connect, not only to their courage, but to their humanity. As we move from fiction into history, we'll hear their voices more directly, in the letters they wrote, in the memories they left behind. First, through the correspondence between Minerva and her husband Manolo, we'll see how love and revolution unfolded side by side. Then, through the eyes of Dedé herself, we'll return to the garden where it all began. How do people stay connected when everything around them is designed to keep them apart? How do you preserve love in a place built to erase identity, silence belief, and extinguish hope? In the letters of Minerva Mirabal and Manolo Tavárez, Love and Resistance in the Time of Trujillo, we are given something rare, a window into the hearts of two people who chose to resist one of the most violent regimes in Latin American history, not only with weapons and strategy, but with tenderness, intellect, and an enduring faith in each other. Rafael Trujillo's dictatorship ruled the Dominican Republic from 1930 to 1961 with a grip so suffocating that even whispering discontent could mean death. His image hung in every public space. His name was spoken with fear or forced reverence. Beneath the surface of national slogans and parades lay a network of secret police, prison camps, and mass disappearances. He was known not only for his brutality, but for the personal nature of his vengeance. Families were targeted, daughters were taken. The cost of speaking out was not just your own life, it was the lives of those you loved. Minerva Mirabal knew that cost, and still she spoke out. Along with her sisters and her husband, Manolo Tavárez, she helped found the 14th of June movement, a clandestine resistance organization that aimed to overthrow the regime. For their efforts, they were harassed, followed, and eventually imprisoned. During that imprisonment, Minerva and Manolo wrote letters to each other. And those letters, careful, coded, full of love, and iron will, are what remains. We enter their correspondence expecting historical testimony, and we get it. But we also get something far more intimate. We find a relationship sustained not in spite of prison, but through it. A bond so deep that even censorship and separation could not sever it. Let us never forget, Minerva writes in one letter, that we are in prison because we have not surrendered, and we will not. These are not dry political statements. They are letters filled with longing for each other, for their children, for the freedom they dreamed of. They talk about food, illness, books they miss, friends they hope are safe. They imagine futures that history would deny them. Darling, Manolo writes, I dream of you every night. I see your smile, and I feel your voice beside me. Minerva replies with her signature blend of affection and fierce resolve. Do not forget that this moment is not forever. We were born for something greater than fear. There is something breathtaking about these words, knowing what we know, that Minerva and her sisters will be murdered not long after these letters were exchanged, that they will be ambushed on a mountain road and left in a staged car accident, and that Manolo too will be executed a few years later by Trujillo's successor. But in these letters, they are alive, vividly and gloriously alive. Their partnership is one of equals. Manolo doesn't patronize or protect Minerva, he reveres her, and she in turn challenges him, comforts him, and shares in the leadership of their cause. It is one of the clearest portraits we have of Minerva, not as a national symbol, but as a whole person, a woman who loved fiercely, mothered tenderly, and resisted with a heart full of conviction. We are not just prisoners, she writes. We are still who we were before. I am still yours, still your Minerva. Even under surveillance, even with censors reading over every line, they find ways to send each other pieces of themselves. There are nicknames and references to their children. There are lines that might appear ordinary but are weighted with private meaning. And then there are moments of levity, even humor, a small act of defiance in a world built on cruelty. Their imprisonment, like so many under Trujillo, was marked by overcrowded cells, inadequate food, illness, and psychological torment. But the letters show how they resisted even that by remaining intellectually engaged, emotionally connected, and spiritually unbroken. Minerva frequently reminds Manolo to read, write, and rest when you can. These are not idle instructions, they are strategies for survival. Keeping the mind sharp, the spirits anchored, these were tools of resistance as essential as any protest or pamphlet. The historical importance of the correspondence cannot be overstated. We often learn history through headlines and declarations through the official record, but these letters let us see it through the lens of a wife writing to her husband, a mother dreaming of her children, a woman remembering love as both a refuge and a reason to keep fighting. In one letter, Minerva writes, I do not want our children to grow up under this shadow. I want them to know a world where they can speak freely, live freely, love without fear. That longing is at the heart of every page. Even as they speak in code, even as they dodge the eyes of their captors, they are building something, a future, a vision, a form of hope that cannot be locked away. Reading their words today, we understand that the revolution was never just fought in the streets. It was fought in these pages, in the quiet act of choosing love in the face of brutality and clinging to each other across walls and wire. After her release, Minerva was offered the chance to remain silent, to retreat, to live a quieter life. She refused. And in the weeks before her assassination, she continued organizing, meeting with other resistance members, and preparing for what came next. When she died not only as a fighter, but as a woman who made peace with what resistance would cost her. And yet the letters do not read like farewells. They read like a love that expected to last. In a final note, Manolo tells Minerva, no matter what happens, we are together, in this life or the next. And in many ways, they are still together, in these letters, in memory, in the movement they helped build, which outlived them and brought down the regime they fought so hard to end. This book is not just a collection of historical documents to be read at a distance. It is a living conversation between two people who chose to fight for their country and for each other, one line at a time. As we turn now to Alive in Their Garden, written by the sister who survived, we'll see what it means to carry memory after the violence ends. We'll sit with Dedé in the garden where it all began and listen to the voice of someone who stayed, not to forget, but to remember. How do you carry a story that isn't yours alone, but one that shaped your entire life? What does it mean to be the one who remains, the one who lives when others are taken? In Alive in Their Garden, Dedé Mirabal tells us, she was not in the car that day in 1960 when her sisters Minerva, Patria, and María Teresa were ambushed and murdered by agents of Trujillo's regime. She was not part of the resistance movement, not imprisoned or tortured, not honored in the immediate aftermath. But Dedé was given something else. Time. Time to grieve, to remember, and eventually to tell. This book is her offering, not just to the world, but to her sisters. It is a deeply personal account of life after loss, of memory as a form of resistance, and of how love, when tended with care, can bloom even in the soil of unimaginable pain. The title itself, Alive in Their Garden, tells us everything. Dedé is not simply honoring the dead, she is cultivating the life they left behind. The garden is literal. The family home in Ojo de Agua, where the sisters grew up, is now a museum, but it is also symbolic. It is the space where their memory is kept, their voices remembered, their impact allowed to grow. Dedé does not write with the distance of a historian, she writes as a sister. There is no romanticizing of grief here, no tidy narrative of redemption. Instead, there is honesty about guilt, anger, confusion, and the long, slow recovery toward healing. In the early years after their deaths, Dedé lived in the shadow of silence. The dictatorship still loomed. People were afraid to say their names aloud. And she, The sister who hadn't joined the cause was left to wonder, why not me? Could I have done more? Should I have? Her account is full of these questions, and in asking them, she gives others permission to ask their own. What do we owe the ones who are gone? What do we do with the time they did not get to have? Over time, Dedé became the voice of the Mirabal legacy. She gave interviews, opened the family home to visitors, and co-founded the Mirabal Sisters Foundation. But none of it came easy. There were years when she didn't want to speak, years when the trauma was too sharp, and yet, through it all, she kept returning to the garden, pruning, planting, remembering. In one passage, she writes, "The world comes to see them here, but sometimes I just want to sit in silence, to hear the birds and think of them as girls again, before the speeches, before the sorrow, just my sisters, laughing in the sun." This image of Dedé sitting alone in the garden says more than any monument could. Her grief is not performative. It is quiet, consistent, lifelong. And yet, in her storytelling, there is also warmth. She doesn't speak of her sisters only as heroines. She speaks of them as women who bickered, dreamed, danced, made mistakes. She paints them whole. There is something grounding in Dedé's presence. In the time of the butterflies, Julia Alvarez gives her the role of the chronicler, the one who looks back. In Alive in Her Garden, we get that voice for real, unfiltered, unembellished. And what we find is a woman who survived not because she was stronger, but because she was spared, and one who turned survival into a calling. Throughout the book, Dedé reflects on the complexity of remembrance. How do you preserve truth without turning it into a myth? How do you tell the story again and again to journalists, to school children, to heads of state, without losing the thread of who they truly were? Her answer is this book. Not a biography, not a history text, but a personal meditation on memory, responsibility, and love. She gives us family stories, everyday anecdotes, the time Minerva smuggled a forbidden book into school, the way Patria whispered bedtime prayers to her children, the letters Mate tucked away into her diary. These moments restore what violence tried to erase, not just their activism, but their humanity. And in doing so, Dedé restores her own story too. No longer the sister on the background, no longer just the one who lived, but the one who remembers, the one who speaks. The historical weight of her voice is undeniable. Under Trujillo's regime, fear was the law of the land. His power infiltrated every aspect of life, the economy, the press, the church, and even the intimacy of the home. Dissent was dangerous, and public mourning for dissenters was even more so. But Dedé mourned anyway, quietly at first, then more publicly, then in full force. By the time of the book's publication, Dedé has spent decades fighting to ensure that her sister's story wasn't flattened into a single day of violence. She wanted people to know what led up to that moment, the years of resistance, the toll on their families, and the love that motivated their bravery. And perhaps most of all, she wanted people to know what came after, that the work of healing, of remembering, is its own kind of resistance. In one of the final chapters, Dedé reflects on how people come to the garden and weep. Some never say a word. Others leave letters or stones. She welcomes them all. "They do not come for me," she writes. "They come for my sisters. But I am here. I have always been here." That quiet resistance, that choice to remain rooted, is the heart of the book. It reminds us that resistance is not always loud. Sometimes it is tending a garden, opening a gate, telling a story again and again until the world learns to listen. Dedé Mirabal passed away in 2014, but her voice lives on, just as her sisters do. Through this book, she leaves behind more than memory. She leaves behind a legacy of care, a reminder that survival, when used to honor the fallen, can be its own kind of courage. And so we end this episode in the place where it began, not with martyrdom, but with love, with voices that refuse to be silenced, with women who bloomed in the harshest soil, and the one who stayed to keep the garden alive. The Mirabal sisters' murder sent shockwaves through the Dominican Republic. What Trujillo intended as a warning became a catalyst. Their deaths, brutal, calculated, laid bare the regime's cruelty, not just to their fellow citizens, but to the world. Outrage stirred in whispers, then gathered in the streets. It became impossible to look away. Just 6 months later, Trujillo himself was ambushed and killed on a dark road outside Santo Domingo. Though the sisters did not see the fall of the dictator they had long opposed, their sacrifice helped to set that reckoning in motion. This story also shows how fragile power can be, even when it appears absolute. Trujillo controlled the military, the police, the press. He silenced dissenters and rewrote national myths. But in the end, all it took was a handful of men, one exposed stretch of road, and the will to pull the trigger. It reminds us that dictatorships often rest not on strength alone, but on the illusion of it. Thank you for reading, listening, and for remembering. In sharing these stories of the Mirabal sisters, of the world they lived in, and of the history that shaped and was reshaped by their courage, you become part of a much larger act of remembrance, one that reaches across time and borders, across pages, and across memories. Every book we read deepens our understanding. Every life we learn about brings us closer to empathy. And every time we speak a name, tell a story, or pass on a truth, we help keep a memory alive, not as something fixed in the past, but as something that still has the power to change the present. Until next time, may you carry these voices with you, and may they continue to inspire you to ask questions and to hold space for the stories that matter.